I've heard you've moved to New York. What happens?
Well,
How did you get there?
For many reasons, personal, family. I'm doing some teaching at New York University also. But I am actually in Europe a lot, so it's not like, I mean, these days moving somewhere is really different from what it used to be. First, you never feel like you move somewhere. You just spend some time somewhere for a while. I still have a place in Berlin, and I don't feel like I moved away or I left Europe. And then also I'm here all the time. I mean, not in Brussels, but in Europe. I just had a few events last month in Germany and Switzerland, and now I'm back for a few events in Europe. And even when I don't have events, I'm flying all the time between Europe and America. So this old romantic idea, the sad and beautiful idea of leaving a continent and then you're somewhere else and you're away from your language and you're in an alien, distant place. It's not like that anymore, because from that alien, distant place, whatever it might be, first you always stay in touch with your language, not just with books, but with the internet. And then also you fly back all the time.
Yeah, but you could say when you live in New York, you hear English around you all the time. That could have an influence on your writing.
Well, I hope I'm not losing my German. I really hope that. But it is true that my very good editor with a certain smile in the manuscript of Tyll showed me 2 sentences where that sounded a bit English, and she said, "You see, it does have an impact." So because I always said it doesn't have an impact at all. So there were 2 sentences. It's true.
How is it to be in America so often in these exciting times, sad times, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, well, it's terrible. It's terrible, but it's also very interesting. It's an interesting moment for a writer to witness, but it is also very sad and upsetting. And I mean, right now it's a very important moment, because the day after tomorrow we'll have the midterm elections, and that will decide, or then we will be able to see whether American democracy is kind of starting to self-correct, or whether it will descend into utter, I don't even know what, utter chaos and further decline of democracy. Because now, if the Republicans don't lose significantly, not just will there not be a check on what they're doing, but it will also mean that they feel they now have a stronger mandate to keep doing what they're doing. So all the things we've seen in terms of hostility towards immigrants, and also those really irresponsible tax cuts and the cutbacks on regulation and environmental regulations that we've seen, if they don't lose the day after tomorrow, then all we've seen will only have been the beginning. But if they lose tomorrow, and if they lose significantly, and it looks like they will lose Congress, then you can say that the framers of the Constitution again kind of were right about what they were doing, because the system does then slowly self-correct, and it would make you also hopeful for 2020. And I do think there's no way that Trump will win again. But of course, I might be wrong.
We didn't think he would win in the first place.
No, I did actually think there was a high likelihood that he would win. Arnon Grünberg mentions this to me quite frequently when we see each other, that I saw him exactly 2 years ago. We were in Groningen together a few days before the US, the presidential election, and I was absolutely freaked out. I was so worried, and he was calming me down and said, "Come on, there's no way he's gonna win." And I said, "I think it's really it's likely that he's gonna win." And Arnon, he actually wrote a little piece about that, how worried I was and how calm he was. And I mean, looking at it in retrospect, and how funny it was that he was so calm. And I'm not usually right about these things, so I'm not telling that saying that to tell you that I was so had such a good sense of what would happen in the future. It was just that I was really worried, because I have a tendency to worry, and still I do not think he can win again in 2020. I'm still be worried, of course, but I'm also optimistic.
We'll stay optimistic. But actually, we're not here to talk about American politics, of course. We're here to talk about Tyll, your latest novel, although it already appeared a year ago. Could you introduce the book, maybe, for the people in the audience who didn't have the opportunity yet to read it?
Well, it's a book set in the 30 Years' War. It's not a book about the 30 Years' War. Martin Amis once said that the word "about" should be actually forbidden when you talk about novels, because they're never about something, but they're in and around something. So this is a book set in the 30 Years' War, and it's actually it has the name of Tyll Eulenspiegel, I know you pronounce him differently in Dutch.
Yeah,
but
we say Tyll Eulenspiegel.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I tried, but I cannot do this wonderful tail. It sounds weird if I do that.
You can stick by Tyll.
Yeah, I have to, yeah. But I know that he's also a very, very prominent character in Dutch culture. It's about a version of him actually quite a while after the time when he didn't live, because people keep tell me, why did you move him in time? And I said, move him from where? And they said, from the time when he actually lived. And I said, he did not actually live. But it's funny that you have a mythical character that ingrained himself so much into the collective memory or consciousness that people think he did live. The only source we have is that someone with a name that sounds like his name died in a certain year close to Mölln on a certain day. So that is not exactly what you would say as a reliable source for those old stories to be true. So I moved him into the 30 Years' War and uses him as kind of a guide for the reader, because he's very prominent in some chapters, and in other chapters he has only a short guest appearance. But it is kind of always about him, but it's also about other people, about quite a lot of other people, which is the first time I ever tried to do a book with that many characters. And some are invented and some are my version of historical characters. And it's really kind of I don't know the English word for that. In German you have that old form of art called Reigen. Reigen, I don't know the word for that, or whether there even is an English word for that. And Reigen, it's kind of a Baroque dance, which is also used in theater, to going from one character to the next. So it's about a group of people moving through those dark times. Yeah,
and it's not written chronologically, actually, so that makes it a bit more complicated, maybe, for the reader.
Yeah, but it's also additional fun if you're like me and you like to put things together. And I know it confuses some people. It is really, if you pick up all the links and hints in the book where the chapters are referring to each other and they do move for back and forth in time, then you will get the whole life story of my Tyll character. So there's not always, you don't always get the reason why he does something or why he shows up somewhere right away, but in some cases the reason comes much later, in a chapter that's actually earlier in time but later in the book. I really I've done that several times now in novels. I like to experiment with structure, to see what you can do, how you can energize a story by playing with the structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's in that case the temporal structure you use to tell that story. That's just something I really enjoy. I know some people just want to have straightforward stories, but that would kind of take away a lot of the fun I have in constructing a novel.
Well, it has to keep being interesting to me too, of course.
Yeah.
So, actually, with this novel, you return to the historical novel. Your big breakthrough novel, Measuring the World, was also a historical novel. And then other novels followed, and they were all set in our contemporary time. So, was there a reason for that?
The reason was that I got interested in the 30 Years' War.
Yeah. No, I mean, was there a reason for not writing about history such a long time?
Yeah, because I did think Measuring the World was a one-time experiment for me. I also kept telling everyone who asked me, I said, that was an experiment, I'm not going to write another historical novel. I was really convinced that it was just a one-time experiment.
Yeah, but you could say it was such a success. It was a great experiment. Let's move on doing this.
Yeah, but that was exactly the opposite of what I wanted to. I felt like if you continue after great success, the worst thing that you can do to yourself is to try to copy the recipe that once worked. Because I felt like I was too young, I still am too young, I hope, to just copy what I did before. I feel it has to be an experiment, it has to be something new, and it has to be something I'm genuinely interested in, not just something that I decide I'm doing because it once worked. And so when I got so interested in the 17th century and in the 30 Years' War, I actually felt like I cannot write about this. I told everyone I'm not going to write another historical novel. And it was a real obstacle to the fact that I always said that for me. And until then I decided that I felt like it's a completely different book from Measuring the World. So I'm also not using any of the stylistic devices from, for example, Measuring the World is the whole book, most of the book is using indirect speech. There are no direct dialogues in the book. I didn't use any of that, but I did feel like, okay, I said I won't do it ever again, and I'm still doing it. What can happen? They won't put me in prison for that. Worst thing is they ask me about it, and then I'll say exactly what I just said.
That wasn't that bad.
Yeah, it wasn't that bad. I agree. So.
It was. But does a historical novel require a different approach for you as a writer? More research, maybe?
Yeah, definitely. It does require more research. Absolutely. In that case, especially. I mean, there was so much more research than Measuring the World, because it's so much further away. First, also, the 30 Years' War is extremely confusing. It's kind of very, very hard to even get an image, to get an idea of what happened and why. And then also the more interesting for me and more difficult part was that people's minds were really different. I think the people in Measuring the World, scientists living towards the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, they were really like us in many ways. We would have no problem whatsoever talking to them or understanding what they say.
So it was easier to get into the minds of Alexander von Humboldt.
Yes, much easier. And here the thing that interested me most was actually getting into the minds of people who would live before Enlightenment. And to kind of emulate how different their mindset and their worldview was. So I could say, as far as psychology is concerned, I was not interested in the similarities to human beings are always the same. That might be true, but they also really, really change. And especially Enlightenment was in many ways the greatest, the most significant, and most profound change that ever happened to the human mind, I think. And to really write from the perspective of people who lived before that, that was the main thing for me. I was of course also interested in the history. I was interested in the 30 Years' War and in that period. But that kind of came second. The thing I was most interested in was the mindset pre-Enlightenment.
And how did you get into that mindset? Did you read, I don't know, literature from that time? Or?
Yeah, you read some literature if you want to do that. You read literature. You in that case, for example, the poems are much more helpful than the novels. But then, of course, the novels are also important. They're very, very hard to read, Baroque novels. Even Grimmelshausen Simplicissimus, which is a great novel,
which
as
is
anyone
also
will
a
tell
novel
you.
About the 30
Yes.
war.
And anyone, I mean, I've met a lot of people who told me, I love that book. I read Grimmelshausen, I love that book. And then when you carefully inquire, you usually find out they read the first chapter when it was printed in a school book. But then in a textbook when they were at school. But then it actually goes on for about 800-900 pages. And parts of it are amazing, but also the Baroque idea of a novel was so much different from what we feel like is an entertaining novel that it is kind of impossible to read any of those books without feeling you're doing some serious work. And that's not true for the poems. The poems of that period, you can, not all of them of course, but many you can just read and you feel like you have a direct connection to these people. But then also other kind of research. When historians in the last 20, 30, even 40 years have done a lot to find out what daily life was like. Before that, the work of a historian just consisted in writing about battles and drawing up battle plans and writing about royal marriages and politics. Yeah. But the question, how did people actually live? They didn't address that, and that changed. I mean, there's a whole it started with the French school of historians, like Philippe Ariès and Duby and others who were really interested in that. And now there are also English language historians and some German historians really interested. And of course, for a writer, that's when it gets interesting. And then also when you really research the conditions of daily life, and also when you learn things about the state of, I can't even say science, that's kind of an, I would say scholarship or thinking. Science is kind of already the way we think about it, is a post-Enlightenment concept. And that's the great thing about being a novelist. Historians have to be very, very careful. I don't have to be as careful. I can just also use my fantasy, my imagination to imagine what it must have been like. And so it doesn't have to, not every detail has to be research based, because it's so I give you an example. There is there's a lot of disagreement among historians about the question what it actually meant for the relationship between parents and children when most children died in young age. So when you had, in the 17th century, when you gave birth to a child, well, the first thing is when you were a man and you married, then the likelihood that your wife would die in childbirth was very high. So you kind of had to think, I will probably lose her. And then when childbirth worked out, then the likelihood of that child making it even past the 5th birthday was really not good. So more children died before the 5th birthday than actually survived that birthday. So the question is, what does that mean for the relationship between parents and children? I think, of course, it meant that people didn't allow themselves to show their children the same amount of affection we do. It's just you have to. Everyone saw their own children die. Mostly everyone. It's kind of, you had to, the way we allow ourselves to love our children, it must have been different. It must have been different in many ways. But then, of course, you have really also heartbreaking poems written by parents when their children die. Or I just saw in in the Rijksmuseum, I forgot by which painter, there's a wonderful small painting, maybe one of you knows that, of a mother with a sick child. And you see the child is dying, and there is so much love in the painting that you see, of course, that also existed. But then on the other hand, it must have meant something profoundly different that most children died. And as a novelist, I can allow myself to be less careful than a historian. So Philip Ariès, in his history of childhood, he says clearly, I don't dare to speculate about that. It's too, and I, of course, it's my job. It says novel, so I can speculate about that. I can, for example, in the beginning, in the first chapter, Tyll, as a young boy, he gets into a fight with one of the farmhands of his father, and that guy nearly kills him, and his parents are standing nearby. And then they don't even fire him, the farmhand who nearly killed their son. He just gets slapped and shouted at, but that's then okay. Then they just move on because it's really hard to get those farmhands. So, and I really think that's not unrealistic in a world where the relationships between parents and children were different. But of course, it is me as a novelist speculating about that.
Yeah, because actually the parents of Tyll already lost 3 children when this incident happens.
Yeah.
He's the only one surviving, actually.
Yeah. You did lose most children in those times. That we actually know pretty well.
Maybe first, before we dive deeper into this 30 years war, you should fresh up our memory a bit, because here in Belgium we're too busy commemorating the First World War right now. So what was this 30 years war? What was it like? In 1 minute.
I'll try in 30 seconds. Let's see whether I can do that. Actually, the funny thing is, no one asked me that. I should have a great answer prepared, but I don't. So I'll try to be very, very brief. It was a war that started. It started when in 1618. When the estates of Bohemia, so the nobility, wasn't called nobility, but it's a different question. So when the nobility of Bohemia fired their own king, if you can do that, and awarded awarded their crown to Frederick V, who is one of the main characters of my book of. The Elector Palatine of Palatia, Pfalz. Yeah. So the mistake they made was they forgot that, or they thought it wasn't that important, that the king, the former king, was also the emperor. So the emperor used to be also the king of Bohemia. So he said. So there was a war. It was
complicated.
Yeah. It was so let's just say the war that then started could have ended soon, but whenever it came close to ending, there was another power entering that war. A little bit like we've seen in Syria. So at first it was a war between the Protestants and the Catholics, which means the people close to the emperor, in the what was called the Reich, the Heilige Römische Reich Deutscher Nation, which is very hard to explain what that even was. And then it grew and grew because Denmark and then Sweden, of course, and then also France thought that they should enter that war. And so whenever it could have ended, it didn't end, and it then turned into what experts call a war of attrition, which is for every party saw that they couldn't win, but they also felt like staying in the war would still be less costly to them than leaving. And whenever that happens, and I'm a little bit afraid to see that we have a similar situation in Syria now, whenever that happens, there's no good scenario of how to end a war like that. And that's why it took 30 years, and towards the end, because everyone was so tired of it, they kind of invented European diplomacy, which is the great thing that came out of it. So the ambassadors of all the powers who were part of the war, which wasn't just the big powers, but also all those small German states and their leaders, in 5 years of negotiation, they managed to actually end that war and create kind of the framework of diplomacy. I know that was far too long already, I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's good to have it in our minds because we're going to talk about it for the rest of the time.
And it was in kind of, that's something I should also add, is that the toll it took on the population was utterly incredible. It was so statistically it was even worse than not just the first, also the Second World War. There were regions of Northern Europe where half the population died, and not because of the big battles, but because of course of the plague or other and because of hunger, and because that was also the thing that defined the 30 Years' War, was that the states had the power and the wealth to assemble gigantic armies, but they couldn't feed them. So the only way to keep those armies, to keep them, was actually to let them loose on the civil population and tell them, take whatever you need. And you can imagine what that meant for the daily life of people.
Yeah, but already it was a difficult time, even at the start of the war. Already there was like a climate change going on. In your book, it's constantly raining or it's freezing. So
called the Little Ice Age, which then in turn also was one of the main reasons why the witch hunts became such kind of flared up so much, because the Little Ice Age destroyed a lot of the harvest, and people were looking for people to blame. And it's amazing how that feeling we have to blame somebody, how the kind of hysteria that can create, and that led to the European witch hunts, which in turn turned all in all. Their estimates are that 100,000 people got killed in the witch hunts. It's one of the great kind of not really processed catastrophes of European history. Those witch hunts, which then after a while just disappeared. People just forgot about their fear of witches.
In short, it was a horrible time to live in.
It was really a horrible time to live in. Yeah, it doesn't mean that it was always horrible for everyone. I mean, I don't want to sound like this is. I mean, like it's not a horror cabinet. I also didn't want to turn the horror cabinet in the book, but it was a really I mean, many people still had a meaningful life, and it was the only life they knew and the only world they knew. But it is true that if you think today's world is bad, then I can tell you it is bad, but it's definitely not the worst time to live in. Definitely. Not yet, of course, not yet.
But how do we have to imagine 30 years of war? Were they fighting all the time?
No, they weren't. That's the point. The big battles. You can also, I mean, some people say that it's easier to imagine the 30 Years' War as kind of a series of different wars going on, sometimes disappearing, sometimes flaring up again. Then there were also regions that kind of were never felt the war, and other regions were destroyed, but then the war disappeared, and then it kind of came back. So people still had normal lives in some places, and the great battles, the one you can, battle museums like Lützen or Wittstock, that's interesting, but that's actually not that important.
It was more like theater. It was like we come together that day, we fight, and then...
Yeah, a little bit like that. No, it was, but the thing that so much, that caused so much devastation, and so that also caused the 30 Years' War to kind of create all these sediments in folk tales and in old stories, why it's such a painful, deep thing in the collective memory of Germany and Northern Europe, is because it meant in many regions the complete breakdown of what we would call civilization. So not the big battles, but the fact that there were all those marauding soldiers just moving through the country. And if you, I mean, that's what my first chapter is about. You could, of course, you could be lucky and never meet any of them. But then, of course, you could meet them. So and that was really terrible. So so that was the worst thing, that those big armies, that there was no infrastructure to give them food. They had to get, and then not just the food, but also like money. They were also allowed to take whatever they wanted. The Swedes were a little bit better. Gustav Adolf really tried to keep it down, the marauding and the stealing. I mean, it wasn't a big issue on his mind, but he tried that a little bit, and the others didn't care at all.
Yeah, because you write about a convent that has been robbed first by the Catholics, then again by the Protestants, then again by the Catholics.
Yes, that actually I didn't invent at all. That I took, there is a really heartbreaking source, the diary of the abt, what's the English word for that? Of the
abbot.
The abbot, yeah, thank you. Of the Kloster Andex, the Andex monastery, with the rather strange Bavarian name Maurus Friesenecker, and he wrote a diary, and that was, I mean, that is actually, I use him as a character. I mean, he comes up as a character in my book, and so he describes exactly that, like one army came, one army left, one army came down, and technically, of course, one of the armies was the army of the Archduke of Bavaria. So they were technically their guys, but that really didn't change anything. When they came, they took everything, whatever they wanted. So it really didn't matter much whether it was their guys or the other guys.
You couldn't trust anyone.
No.
So this meant 30 years of fear, of insecurity for people.
Yeah, I mean, it also meant, again, it's not a horror show. It also meant that great music was composed in those years. Great paintings were created.
Yeah, because actually, this you write that it's sort of the beginning of poetry in German.
Yeah.
We meet a guy. What was his name again?
Fleming.
Fleming. Yeah.
Fleming. Yes, he was a wonderful poet, an absolutely wonderful poet who then who wrote poems which are so beautiful. You can still read them, and they move you so much. And he died very young. He didn't even turn, I have to look it up, but he turned 30. I think he didn't even turn 30. So he died very young. And he's one of those cases, like Georg Büchner later, where you wonder where you feel like German literature would be different if Paul Fleming would have lived as a writer and become 80 years old. Like, he was such a genius that it would have created completely different movements in German literature. And I feel the same about Georg Büchner. So with him, it's really one of those lost chances of German literature. And I felt that he's only a minor character, but I had to put him in the book for that reason.
Yeah, one of the many characters.
Yes, it's a book full of characters, and one of the things I also tried to do is some characters stay with you, some characters leave the book after a few pages, and you don't know which characters are going to stay with you or which are going to leave, which is in a lot of ways like life was back then, because it was really hard to stay in touch, especially for people who didn't read or who were not able to read or write. So if someone said goodbye and you left a person's village, why would you couldn't stay in touch. So some people you would meet again, and some people you would never meet again, and you couldn't really influence that a lot. So and I wanted to kind of recreate that feeling of you cannot really anticipate who will be with you for a long time and who won't.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to recreate that in the novel.
Yeah. And why did you get interested in this 30 Years War in the first place?
I don't know.
Was it like, okay, it's almost 2018, it will be 400 years ago?
No, I really didn't think of that. I started writing that or thinking about it in 2012 already, and I really didn't think of 2018 and the 400-year anniversary. I don't really know why. Because you don't, as a writer, you don't decide what you're interested in. You find out what you're interested in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think maybe it was a natural thing because I was kind of formed and shaped by magical realism in a way as a writer. And I'm also, so it was maybe kind of a natural thing that I got interested in. What must the world have been like to people for whom a world that was magical realism for everyone, because no one was a rational human being the way we would have thought of rational human beings, the way we think of them, what they are like. But then, of course, there was not a playful, beautiful thing, but a rather dark and fearful thing. And then, of course, I also felt like I want to write about the darkest moment of that period, and that was the 30 Years War. And then I felt like I need a guide, someone who can go everywhere in a static society, someone who moves, who can meet kings, but also farmers, and someone who also changes place in a world where people usually don't travel. And that would have been someone, a vagrant, someone who moves, like an entertainer, a fool, a jester. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, okay, why not cast the great German Dutch jester? Why not cast Tyll Windspiegel? I mean, as a writer, you can cast everyone.
I don't know. I mean, it can be quite stressing to work with a character that already exists in history for so many times.
Yeah, I mean, in his case, it was really strange because I really felt, and I never had that with any other character. I felt like he was really there in a way when I started writing his story, which most of it I invented for the book. But I really felt like, I mean, I never wrote about a mythical character before, and he's kind of a mythical character, and I felt like he was really present for me. So I never had to, when I had him say something, when I in a dialogue, I never had to think, what is he going to say now? It always, whenever I wanted to write it, it was there. It was like he said it. And also much of what he's saying I don't quite understand. So and I didn't have that with the other characters. Like, for example, another important character in the book is Athanasius Kircher, the famous polyhistor of Baroque, a man who was revered as the greatest scholar of his age, and if we can use the term here, the greatest scientist. And who actually happened to block the development of Western science for about 100 years, because he describes so many experiments and they just don't work the way he describes them. So he invented them. But he was such a great authority that no one even dared think of that. He also wrote a three volumes, very influential, where he about Egyptian hieroglyphs. Mm-hmm. So he claimed to have solved Egyptian hieroglyphs, and as you know, it wasn't Athanasius Kircher, it was somebody else. So he made a few good guesses, but a lot he just invented.
Yeah,
So
because when they bring him a stone with hieroglyphs that doesn't fit his theory, it's the stone that's not okay. It's not his theory that is.
yeah, I mean, that's not something he said. That's something my character said, of course. But I mean, he would have thought that, of course. And that if the old stone says something wrong, then the old scribe did something wrong, because he saw himself and everyone else saw him as the greatest authority on pretty much everything.
Yeah.
And
music, for instance.
And music, where actually he did
the cat piano.
I mean, that was one of the ideas that he I don't think he ever built it, but he actually had the idea.
Maybe you should explain what it is.
It's an idea. It's an idea that the real Athanasiuskirche had. I think this is a very important point to make. Otherwise, you will think very badly of me as a person. So he actually toyed with the idea of building a piano where instead of strings you would have living cats, kind of strapped on the piano, and they would have different voices, and if you tune it well, you could play on those cats by just hitting them. And he actually describes that idea. I don't think anyone ever built it, but you can see there is something really interesting about him as a human being. And so I felt like that's a great character for
He was also a dragon hunter.
Yeah, that of course I invented. He never hunted a dragon, but in the 17th century. The science of dragon was still a well-regarded part of scholarship. It was called dracontology, and that's what I found fascinating. They weren't stupid. They knew that they didn't have dragons at their disposal. So it was actually the science of how to heal people by using things that were dragon-like. So some flowers were regarded as looking like the eyes of dragons, so they would be good for your eyes. Some grass would be like the skin of a dragon, so it would be good for your skin. And so it was all kind of based on the similarity to a dragon, which it wasn't quite clear. They wouldn't have said they don't exist. They would just say they're hiding somewhere. And then I kind of turned it up a bit by having Athanasiuskirche also explain that, of course, you never see a dragon because they're hiding so well. Actually, the place where you can be sure to find a dragon is a place where no one has ever seen a dragon, because they hide so well. So, and actually, how did I get that idea? From discussions with the pediatrician of my son about homeopathy and about vaccination. If you talk to people who believe in some kinds of alternative medicine, they will explain to you that if a substance is really not there anymore, that's when it can really help you. So, and I'm not saying they're wrong. I'm just saying it gave me an idea for my novel.
Yeah, but this is an interesting point you make, actually, because, okay, when you read about this Athanasiuskirche, you think, how is it possible that people work like that? I mean, we meet him actually at a point where he is, because he's also a religious guy, he's a Jesuit,
yes,
and he's hunting for magicians, actually.
And that again I invented. So
yeah. You need to tell a story, of course.
Yes,
but this is the first time when we met him. So he's against these people who are performing magic.
Or so he thinks.
Or so he thinks. But on the other hand, what he's doing isn't exactly what we would call science today.
Yeah, but in that regard, I would really defend him. And I mean, we shouldn't be too arrogant about that, because what we call science is a method that wasn't invented yet. Yeah. That's what Enlightenment did. So that's why, for example, I wouldn't say that these people were superstitious. That would be wrong, because even the alternative between being rational and being superstitious didn't exist in the same way. Of course, it's funny it's funny to play with the idea that they still believe in dragons. But then on the other hand, why would a magnet work and a curse doesn't work? for us, we know why magnets work. Actually, most people don't know it. Including me. There's a beautiful interview with the great Richard Feynman. You can see it on YouTube, where they ask him why does magnetism work, and I really encourage you to listen to his answer, because it's absolutely wonderful. But so what I mean from that perspective, there's no good reason why magnets would work, but a curse doesn't work. So it would be arrogant to say, why did these people not know better? They didn't know better because knowledge had to develop and our understanding of the world had to develop. And so even when someone like Kircher just invented some of his experiments, I wouldn't say that he was a fraud. He wasn't like people today who just invent an experiment to then maybe get a chair at a university. No, in that mindset, you know what's going to happen because you have thought about it, and you have thought about it really well. And if you're really sure you know what's going to happen, then you can actually save yourself the time from doing the experiment. You just write down what's supposed to happen because you've thought about it already, and you move on, you save time. That's funny for us, but if that's what I mean. If you kind of try to enter a different mindset, it's actually very interesting and helpful to become clear about the fact that people who are as intelligent as we are not more intelligent than they are, that they would have thought like that. That's what I mean when I say the human mind really changes over time.
So maybe this also means we shouldn't trust our own scientists too much, because in like 100, 200 years they will look at us and think,
Well, I would say we can trust science, because science is a method that really works very well for producing knowledge about the things that science is researching or trying to find out. The experimental method is something that works really well. So I'm not saying it's as good as Baroque science. It's definitely much better. But I think what we have to be skeptical or careful about is our presumptions about the human mind. That's a more. But I think I'm a big fan of science. That's also why I wrote Measuring the World, because I do think that science that created the most reliable method of understanding the world and the most successful method of understanding the world that we have ever come up with. And also it did create some real progress. I mean, the fact that we all can be here and most of us are not in pain, that would have been unthinkable only 200 years ago. Most of the life of mostly everyone was always full of chronic pain. So it's very easy to be against science as long as you don't think about all that, or as long as you're not in pain. But and of course science has created some other problems, definitely. But I still think it's also the best way to solve it's also the best method to find a solution for the problems it has created.
But it's quickly surpassed by a new invention, because that is also happening in Measuring the World. I mean, you have Humboldt traveling to Latin America, working with instruments that even in his lifetime aren't accurate anymore.
That's the sad thing, of course, if you compare science to art, that in art something just can stay. You can read a poem by Paul Fleming and it will speak to you directly. And it's not like somebody else wrote poems that made them obsolete. And of course in science, the work of science is all about the results and the progress. So of course we can still, we still have a lot of admiration for people like, I don't know, like Leeuwenhoek or de Broglie, but it's kind of historical admiration. It's not like their work will not speak to you the same way as a Shakespeare play.
Absolutely. We were talking about Tyll Eulenspiegel formerly, because actually that is maybe a bit misleading about the book. It's called Tyll, in Dutch, and you think, oh, this is a story we already know. And actually it isn't when you read it. So I still not know why you chose Tyll Eulenspiegel. I mean, I know you told you wanted someone who came in all these regions and with all these different people, but what interested you with the historical character of Tyll Eulenspiegel? I mean, historical literature.
Well, the fact that he's so strange, because when I was a child, I read like many children, I think even still today, I read the retelling of his of some of his adventures by Erich Kästner, and I enjoyed it, of course. But then also Kästner said, and also wherever Tyll Eulenspiegel came up, they always said like he was showing people their folly. He's doing these pranks just to show people how stupid they are, so they learn. And I always felt like that's not quite true. He's just mean. How is he showing them their folly? By, for example, and I used that story in the first chapter when he's telling everyone to take off their right shoe and throw it into the air, and then there's a big fight because people cannot find their shoes, and then Erich Kästner tells us this is so. Again, he showed people how stupid they are, and I don't think so. The story demonstrates that people had all the same shoes. That's what it doesn't demonstrate that people were stupid. And it's also true if you look into the history of the jester or the fool, then they show up in a moment in European history when the thing that Norbert Elias calls the process of civilization starts. So people start to get civilized. Like they stop eating with their hands. There's a taboo on spitting. There is a taboo on defecating in front of the house. You have to go to the back of the house. So people learn all that. The fool is before he's kind of a witty person who shows people the truth. Is just a person who does not enter into that process of civilization. So he's mostly like a dangerous psychopath in a way. And C.G. Jung has in a very good essay about the Picaro character, he goes even further and says the image behind the Picaro is a human being that's still part animal. And that's not as strange as it sounds if you think of the fact that for example, the famous head of the jester with the little bells, that is actually derived from the horns of a cow, or any kind of animal with two horns. So, which is also true for the devil, by the way, in this horn. How do you say it? Can you call it this costume with the horns? So. There is something really strange and confusing and dark, and of course really anarchist, but in a very deep sense anarchist, about all the fools and jesters. And then I was also kind of always really impressed by Shakespeare's fools. There was Shakespeare also shows up in the book, and I don't use the name, but it's pretty clear that it's Shakespeare. And I was always impressed by Shakespeare's fools, and for all that, I think there is something much more complex and fascinating and also dark and frightening about the character of the fool than the Tyll Eulenspiegel retellings for children will tell us. Yeah, if they just insisted he was like an early Enlightenment guy who taught people not to be stupid. He didn't do that at all. He didn't care.
Well, you see about two faces of him, because in the first chapter, when he just told, he asks people to throw shoes. He's not really friendly to his audience. He's friendly in the beginning, not at the end. He leaves when everyone is fighting. People are getting killed in this fight. On the other hand, he becomes a jester at court with the king, Friedrich, the one who started.
Who's not a king, who just pretends to be a king because he's the winter king of Bohemia, so he lost that battle and then had to leave and is living in exile. But he still wants to have a court, and part of a court is a jester. I mean, I invented all that. Not that he was living in exile, but that he had a court jester, and that court jester is then Tyll.
It's a bit sad actually, because he leaves for The Hague, I guess. It's in Holland. And he lives in a townhouse, and the throne hall is actually the place where the servants are sleeping also.
I mean the chapter I was more influenced by. It's not really, the details are not really as they were. I was more thinking of a Samuel Beckett situation, like the king and his wife and all the servants. And if you read carefully, you find out that that especially Elizabeth, when she thinks about that, but they don't want to think about it. Elizabeth is his wife, the daughter of the King of England, and then she kind of in passing mentions that the gardener is also doubling as the cook, and the cook is also the master of ceremonies, and like when you read carefully, the amount of servants shrinks, and also the palace shrinks, and it turns out more or less that they're just living in a small house with 2 or 3 people, and they don't have a palace at all. It's really very, very small, and they don't even have money to feed the horses. That's why they don't have horses anymore, and also they don't need horses. So it's really a very, very small existence, but they're very famous, and they still pretend to be king and queen. So it's you cannot write that kind of thing without being, in a way, being influenced or thinking about or like feeling or going for like the atmosphere of Shakespeare comedies. There was a great influence for that. It's when you deal with kings and queens and their abdication and that stuff, then you are in kind of in Shakespeare world, which in that context totally made sense to me, and that's something I actually found out in my research. I then asked some historians about it, and I was very, very happy when they said, yeah, it's true, because Frederick the Fifth was actually not just the only German nobleman, he was the only person in Germany, most likely, who saw Shakespeare, who knew him. Because when he and Elizabeth married, they in England, they were actually playing The Tempest, and the Tempest was played by the King's Man. And the King's Man, that was Shakespeare's company. And that big mask towards the end of The Tempest, which most directors like to cut because it's really boring for us today, it was written for their marriage. So that was a way to kind of get Shakespeare himself into the book, because I was dealing with, in Elizabeth and Frederick, with the only 2 people, I think. Definitely the only 2 people in Germany about whom we know that they must have seen Shakespeare. I think I was amazed by that.
Yeah, and Elizabeth is a big theater fan also in the book.
Yes, because she grew up seeing Shakespeare played by Shakespeare and his people and his theater, his company. And I was thinking, what will that do to a person, to a human being, to grow up with not just with good theater, but with the best theater that any human being could ever have had. Shakespeare played by Shakespeare, and Burbage and Kent and those legendary people. And so it turns her into a very theatrical person, someone who always imagines herself to be on a stage. I mean, how can she not?
And then she ends up in Germany and in Holland,
yes,
which is quite disappointing.
Of course, how can she not?
But what I was going to is that actually when we see Tyll over there, he's not that mean to the king. Because a jester is meant to say horrible things to him.
Yeah, because the king is dying. I mean, when he's alone with the king and the king is dying, which is again like a King Lear situation. Only that the king is young and is dying in the snow. so it's kind of a little bit reverted, but it's still a clear situation, but he becomes very nice. So Tyll is not always mean. Like, he always surprised me there. I didn't really plan all that. I mean, the way, I was always surprised when I wrote it by how Tyll was behaving in different situations. I didn't plan that. It was very exciting for me. It was part of one of the adventures of writing that book, to see how Tyll would behave again.
Yeah. Because he comes in the most horrible situations. He's like in a mine somewhere in Brno.
Yeah.
He's at the last battle of the war, actually, Zusmarshausen, I guess it was.
Yes.
And yet he always seems to escape.
Yeah, he's a master of escaping. That was also what kind of some of the relief I found by writing this dark book, was to have a character that always escapes, because it's part of his, and in the beginning he just escapes because he's lucky or good at that, and then more and more he escapes from situations where you can actually not escape from, but he will still escape, like when he's underground with the miners. So so there is I felt like I had to use this element of him while he gets older, turning into a mythical character in a way. So that's also why the other characters become more important than him, because he turns out to be less and less of a regular human being. He actually he starts out as a regular human being, but more and more he turns into the mythical character that we know. And I also feel like he will, I mean, he doesn't, I don't think I'm giving away the end if I tell you he's not dying, he doesn't die at the end, because I feel he doesn't die, it's not something he does.
Well, yeah, you've brought him alive again, I guess.
Yeah, and I really felt like I brought him alive again, but other writers did that before me, there are many examples, and other writers will do that later. So I felt like really I'm one of many writers who had the privilege to spend time with him for a little while, and then it will be someone else.
Did you study all the other versions, the Belgian one, for instance?
Yeah, of course. I really, I think that's it's really a very 19th century book, but it's a great book. It's a great novel. I admire this novel, the Charles de Coster. Is it the Costa or the Coaster? The Coaster. I admire that book very much. Yeah. I actually read it not for. I didn't read it now. I read it when I was about 25, and I really enjoyed it back then. Yeah.
Because it's interesting from this version, Tyll in Flanders, of course, actually became like some political hero.
He was always used for diverse stuff by writers. So he became a political resistance fighter with de Coster. He was in the First World War in a terrible verse epic written by Gerhard Hauptmann. Yeah, no one knows that anymore, which is good, but that I researched for the book. He was, it seems like not just did other writers use him, but other writers also like to move him in time. It seems like something people always did with fools, like move fool characters, jester characters, move them in history.
Yeah, well, maybe someone will write about 21st century and have a new version.
I think that's pretty likely.
Yeah. But actually, when we encountered Tyll as a child, we already spoke a bit about it. He's quite a weak character. He grows up with a father, Klaus, who is actually considered to be a magician later onwards.
Yeah, sorcerer, yeah.
Yeah, because he cures people with spells, with amulets. And actually I was quite surprised to read that superstition, magic, was still so present in society back then.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it really was. It's as I said, you didn't even have the option to decide between superstition and reason, because why would there was no good reason to think that spells wouldn't work. So I mean, I'm not going to go into the history of medicine, but it's also something I tried to research. But these kind of people who knew a little bit about healing, and so that meant they knew a little bit about what herbs would work and would help you, and what tea would help you. But then also they would know spells, and people didn't really see a difference between a herb that would take away some pain, or some tea that would do that, or a spell that would do that. And
because they were living in a village somewhere in the forest, not near a city. So
yeah, but it's not like you would have been better off in the city. I mean, if you would have gone to a doctor in the 17th century, if you were in the 17th century and you were sick, you were much better off not going to a doctor. I can tell you that. Don't go, even go close. They would have killed you. Actually, the only people that would have had a chance of helping you would have been people who knew about the mushrooms and the herbs, and those were the people that were then persecuted in the witch hunts, which is also one of the many aspects of the European witch hunts, was the campaign of medical doctors against the people who had this knowledge of how to heal with herbs
and curses,
nature.
of course.
And curse, yeah, that was always part of it. So the idea that curses that a mushroom can help you, but a curse cannot help you, I don't think people really had that. That came later.
Where did you find curses, or did you invent them?
No, I actually didn't invent them. No. There are books about. They're in German, but I can recommend them. There's a very good book, C.H. Beck Verlag, Helmut Birkan, Magie im Mittelalter. Lots of curses, actually. Lots of curses. It's very interesting. It's a wonderful book.
Yeah, because this magical element is something we come across in a lot of your books. You're quite interested.
Yeah, there was one thing that really fueled my interest in that whole period, because it's really different to deal with magic in a world where everyone believes in magic. It's less like a playful thing, like I used it in Measuring the World, where there are also some ghosts show up, but it's like a playful thing. It's more like a joke. And in that world, it's not a joke. It's real for everyone. For that reason.
Even in other books, like the one you wrote before Tyll, You Should Have Left.
Yes.
It's also like someone rents an Airbnb apartment and all stuff is going wrong.
Yes.
There are all of a sudden rooms that appear that weren't there before.
It's really a classical ghost story. So but again, that's different, because it happens in a world where people don't believe in ghosts, including me. And that is a world where everyone believes in ghosts. So, but in a way, it was kind of, that's why I think it's kind of natural that I got there, that I got interested in that pre-Enlightenment world.
Yeah. But there must be something that fascinates you about, because it's what you say, you don't believe in ghosts. We all don't believe in ghosts anymore because it's scientific not possible. And yet, in your books, we come across certain situations that just can't happen and still they happen.
Again, I can't explain that, because you just find out what you're interested in. It's not a decision. I just love ghost stories.
The book ends eventually with the end of the war, which is the peace process of Westphalia. Tyll is also present there. And it's quite funny how you describe this, because I get the feeling this whole process in Westphalia has been more complicated than the Brexit.
Yes, it also took much longer, but
3 years they had to settle who is allowed to talk with who.
It was a terribly complicated process, because there was no European diplomacy, but it had to be invented for this, and it's really an amazing achievement. It's something that tells you a lot about the unfairness of how we look at history, is that so many people know about Wallenstein and Gustav Adolf and Tilly, those generals, and of course the emperor, and no one knows about Alvise Contarini, who was the Vatican ambassador to Westphalia, who was actually the only person allowed to speak to Venice, the ambassador of Venice, not Vatican, who was actually the only person allowed to speak to Protestant and Catholics, and the French ambassador, and the Swedish ambassador, so to speak to everyone, because they were not allowed to talk to each other. So there would have been a peace without him. Sorry?
They were allowed to dance when there was a ball together, but they were.
Yeah, I think so. I invented that, but I'm actually not sure about that. But so those people who have actually ended that war, those ambassadors, they did something incredible, and they were completely forgotten. And about the other people, you have all those movies, and about the generals, you have all those movies and plays. It's interesting, yeah.
But you said before it was like the start of European diplomacy. That means before you didn't have it like that. That was with like
you didn't have a framework of diplomacy in terms of ambassadors who knew they could talk to each other, with a way of talking to each other. It was also complicated. They needed a year to find out who was allowed to talk to whom, and then who had to greet first, who was required to sit, who was required to stand. All those incredibly complicated things. Which sounds funny to us, but they had to settle the protocol, because in Baroque world everything was about appearances, later they had those things settled, so they could use that later. They had a way of how you could send out ambassadors who then could talk to another ambassador. So if there's one good thing that this terrible war really brought into the world, that was that it created modern diplomacy. But they had to, in a way, they had to create that while the war was going on and on in an impossible situation, not being allowed to talk to each other. That's something that you, on the paintings about Westphalia, usually see all those very serious people sitting around a big table, but they never did that. There was not a single moment when they were in the same room. There was also not a single moment when they all said, "Now it's over." Now, so it was like a complicated framework of contracts and treaties slowly coming into existence between people who were not allowed to meet because they were considered mortal enemies. And the idea that even if you're mortal enemies, the ambassadors still talk to each other, that didn't exist. So. Again, without that one man, Alvise Contarini, who was allowed to talk to everyone because he came from Venice, eventually the war would have ended, they always do, but I don't know how.
Well, maybe it could have gone on and on until now, of course.
They never do. Eventually people always get tired, but it can take a long time.
But with this conclusion in Westphalia, we got a conclusion, and it was that King Friedrich, about whom we already spoke, was actually to blame for this war. However, well, I mean, it's kind of the thing they say at the end. Of course, it's more complicated.
Well, everyone blamed him, but he made a few mistakes, but a lot of people were to blame, of course. Yeah.
But that is actually the interesting thing about the book, because you have 8 chapters, you have so many different visions about the war, about what is happening. Sometimes someone is saying one thing, someone else is saying the complete opposite thing. So as a reader, you're asking yourself, but who is actually right?
But that's what a novel should do, I think. Yeah. That's the difference between a novel and a non-fiction book. I think in a novel, most people, ideally everyone, has to be right in their own way. And they are, I'm not saying there is no truth. There definitely is a truth. But it's often very complicated to find. It's hard.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking, we have been talking so much lately about this alternative facts and post-truth, and you live in New York, you've heard a lot about it, I guess. Was it also something that you were thinking about when writing this book, this whole discussion about?
Not really. I started it in 2012. Started working on it. So no, I can't. I can't say that, because all that I had just 2 chapters missing when Trump won the election, and then I finished the book, and actually thinking of Tyll and how he can deal with every dark situation, that helped me a lot to finish the book. But that whole discussion about lies, but the thing that really, the thing that the 17th century can really teach you is that only the term alternative facts or fake news is new. It used to be always there. It was called propaganda. So all of Europe was flooded with propaganda leaflets, full of incredible lies and inventions, and all sides produced them all the time. So I don't really see what is new is the way the American president is lying all the time. But the idea that lies are used relentlessly in politics, that has happened before, obviously. And yeah, it was just called propaganda. So only the term fake news is new.
Yeah, and maybe not only in politics, because we encounter a character, Martin von Wolkenstein. I guess he's someone you've invented, because
Yes.
I didn't find any traces
Yes,
of
I did.
him. But he's like a big fat count working for the emperor, the Habsburg emperor. And he writes his memories only 50 years afterwards. He witnessed, well, maybe you should tell, he witnessed last...
Yeah, I mean, he's present at the last battle of the war, and he writes his memoirs 50 years later, and he gets a lot of things wrong. And the book always gives you both versions, what happens and how he describes it. But that's not propaganda, that's just an old man having a foggy memory. I think that's kind of... You can give him. I mean, that's not a bad thing. That's kind of what happens in life 50 years later.
But it's actually quite beautiful, because you write somewhere the way he remembers it. If he would write it authentically, it wouldn't fit the images he have in his head.
Yeah, that happens.
So
with
actually,
memoirs. That happens with memoirs. I mean, memoirs were always. It's just again like you can call it fake news, but it's just people invent a lot of things in their memoirs, and all good memoirs actually start out by people saying, "I'm trying to be truthful here, but it's going to be difficult."
Or maybe this is where it starts to be literature.
Yeah, I mean, in memoirs, that's the beautiful thing about memoirs. You can never fully trust them, but they can still be beautiful.
So here we enter actually a theme that will be discussed here in Passa Porta on Tuesday, and it's the border between non-fiction and fiction. Is non-fiction more reliable than fiction? What do you think?
That's too complicated a question. I mean,
it
depends what you mean by real. It really, I don't have a good answer.
Reliable, not real.
It is in a way. It is. But it's, yeah, I would say yes, non-fiction should be more reliable, but fiction is more fun.
I guess this is a good idea to conclude the evening with. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.